Thank you, Peter. Well, let's see. We have next up here, we have Nicole Baumer, Evangelical Beliefs versus the Secular World, Shifting Perceptions of Self and Society in Evangelical Conversion Narratives. So do you need to share a presentation, Nicole?
Yes, I was just wondering if that was possible.
Yeah, we can make you an admin so you can share screen here. Let's see. I think.
Yeah, I did it. You should be able to share now, Nicole.
Okay, cool. Thank you,
Okay.
Max.
There we go. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so before I start, I just want to say thank you so much for hosting me today. I greatly appreciate the honor. My name is Nicole Baumer, and I'm a second-year anthropology graduate student at the University of Denver. And I'll be honest, my research focus is not applied anthropology, but I was encouraged to join this conference by Lucor Jordan, who sent out an email to the grad student body letting us know we were welcome to submit abstracts, even if our research did not necessarily fit within the conference themes and the purview of applied anthropology. And that's the reason I'm here right now. And also just a forewarning, my presentation is only about 15 minutes long because it was designed for another conference that I will be presenting at next month. So I will not be taking up the full amount of time allocated to me today. But to start off, I was in the middle of an interview with Sarah, and we were discussing her perspectives on the person she was before her evangelical conversion experience. And she paused a moment to think, and then she told me, she's like, I'm still the same social security number. I'm still the same DNA, and I'm still the same name and everything. I still have the same family, but I am not at all the person I was before my conversion. And she continued, I'm forever grateful for that. And I tell the Lord often, thank you for pulling me out of the world. And so I believe when Sarah refers to the world, she is talking about this non-evangelical secular reality that surrounds her in the United States. Ever since Sarah converted to evangelical Christianity, she has understood life through this lens of an evangelical belief system that differs dramatically from the secular world around her. And there are several key beliefs that constitute this evangelical worldview. Probably the most central of these being the idea that true salvation can only be found in a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and that this relationship can only be accomplished when individuals believe in Jesus as the Son of God and repent of their sins, therefore making Jesus their personal Savior. And another important facet of the evangelical worldview is the primacy of the Bible. And writing in 2002, one researcher noted that evangelicals today are generally defined by their belief in the infallibility of the Bible as the inspired word of God. And so by ascribing to this evangelical worldview, Sarah, like many evangelicals before her, has found herself in opposition against a newly revealed secular world. And the dichotomous perspective she described to me is not at all unusual in anthropological accounts of conversions to conservative forms of Christianity, particularly Christianity's Pentecostal, charismatic, and evangelical variants. And within the anthropology of Christianity, researchers generally use the term rupture to describe these types of conversion experiences because they are often thought to entail a rupturing effect that leads the converts to have distinct pre-conversion and post-conversion selves. So as somebody who was raised in a church environment fairly similar to evangelicalism and currently attends a local evangelical church, I've frequently been exposed to this notion of radical change in the lives of converts. Within the evangelical church environment I currently find myself, there exists this unquestioned assumption that part of being an evangelical Christian is a radical separation from the surrounding non-evangelical world. And much of this, I believe, stems from the fact that, in accordance to the key features of evangelicalism I just described, Attendees at my church are taught to orient everything around the Bible, and they're exhorted to live their lives in accordance to the dictates contained within the scriptures. And writing in 2007, Smith noted that Christians are taught to embrace the teachings of Jesus because this provides them with instructions that help them navigate their actions and choices in life. And there are numerous Bible verses that speak to this idea of evangelical Christians inhabiting a different reality than non-believers. And Jesus himself, the founder and architect of the Christian faith, frequently spoke about this concept. For example, in the Gospel of John, Jesus tells his followers that if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you're not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. And so essentially what Jesus is doing here is he is warning his followers that they are not to be surprised that their belief system is offensive in the eyes of non-believers. Jesus pointed to the fact that he himself was rejected by many people because of his teachings as proof that part of following him was experiencing rejection from everybody around you that didn't share the same belief system. And so with potent language and powerful word pictures such as this from the founder of their faith, it is not at all surprising that converts to evangelical Christianity would suddenly find themselves at odds with any non-evangelicals upon their conversion experience. And in fact, I believe that Sarah's earlier references to the world likely stem directly from this distinction that Jesus made between those who believed in him and the surrounding world of non-believers. And this belief that an evangelical conversion experience carves out a separate space for new adherents and sets them up in opposition against a newly discovered secular world was encapsulated in my meeting with a pastor and his wife to discuss the possibility of my conducting research at their church to examine this phenomenon. When I explained the research criteria for the types of individuals I was hoping to recruit, they immediately began telling me about some of the most dramatic conversion experiences they've witnessed in their 20 plus years of ministry. And it was very clear to me that not only did they accept without question this belief that a genuine convert to evangelical Christianity experiences a dramatic disruption from their pre-evangelical lives and social worlds, they also clearly believed that this disruption was a good and a desirable thing. So, given the fact that there is a significant amount of anthropological research supporting this notion of radical change in the lives of converts, as well as having been exposed to both the biblical and the church perceptions regarding conversion disruptions my entire life, I decided to conduct an ethnographic research project examining what impact this phenomenon has had upon the lives of members within my own community. Through the lens of narrative analysis, I analyzed the conversion narratives of 6 US American adult converts to evangelical Christianity in order to identify the various ways that the rupture of their evangelical conversion experiences had or had not impacted their perceptions of themselves, as well as their surrounding social worlds. And I do want to stop here and briefly acknowledge that this may not initially seem like a large sample size, but I specifically chose to limit the sample size to 6 individuals because I was carrying out an in-depth series of 3 interviews with each participant. And this methodology suited my desire to conduct a very detailed and extensive exploration into the effects of conversion on these participants. And as I analyzed these 6 conversion narratives, I quickly discovered that one key way participants articulated their understandings of how they have changed after their evangelical conversion experiences could be found in the descriptions of how they believe their personalities have changed or shifted as they have adapted their beliefs to adhere to the evangelical world they now inhabit. They all discussed how they believed that their adopted evangelical belief system caused definite personality and temperament changes that then affected their social lives and their interactions with the newly discovered secular world. So, in the narrative accounts of 2 of the female participants, They both described ways that becoming an evangelical Christian impacted their social worlds to the extent that they went from self-described shy people to women boldly unafraid to share their faith. One of the participants, Penny, recounted how, after her conversion, the most important thing in life to her was sharing the gospel with people. And she told me pretty much anybody I talked to, I shared the gospel with them. That was really different from me. And that way I changed because I was this really shy little person. I would never have done anything like that before my conversion. She even detailed a very memorable experience of proselytizing to her English professor, which she acknowledged did not end well for her. But surprisingly, she didn't care about that. Through the lens of hindsight, she told me, I knew how ridiculous it was, and I knew I was going to be mincemeat, but I didn't care. I felt brave in the Lord. Penny's view of the surrounding social reality was so changed by her evangelical conversion that she went from, in her own words, a really shy little person to someone who boldly put herself into situations that other people might not think very appropriate, such as a student attempting to proselytize a professor. By her own account, God instilled within her a bravery that enabled her to live like this. Renee likewise described her pre-evangelical conversion self as being a quiet introvert. She still identifies as an introvert today, but says she is now much more comfortable with people and much more willing to share what she believes, even in situations where she recognizes people will not agree with her views. She told me, I have a lot more confidence. I don't know whether I want to call it self-confidence, but I'm not so worried about what people think of me. And that used to be big before my conversion. Like Penny, it appears to me that Renee's evangelical conversion changed her social self. She believes that her evangelical faith gave her self-worth and freedom from continually worrying what other people thought about her. Several of the male participants detailed how they became less selfish after their conversions. One of the participants told me that he went from a self-centered life to a God-centered life, and it wasn't all about me anymore, which it always was before. Later, in another interview, he further clarified this by stating that going to work, before I was a Christian, I went to work so that I could get money, so that I could go out and party, have nice things, meet hot girls, and have dates. It was all about me. Now I go to work to help support 6 different families and my own family so that I can give to the church, so that I can help other people grow a business. It's different. By his own account, his perceptions of the world and finding meaning in it shifted dramatically after his evangelical conversion. From his perspective, his evangelical worldview helped him become a more selfless and better functioning social being. A few participants even explained how they believed their temperaments had changed as a result of their evangelical conversion experiences, which then altered the way they interacted with their social worlds. In Ben's case, he believes his evangelical self has done a better job of relating to the world in general in a more positive way, to try and receive people for what they are and how they don't intend to affront me or cause me anger. As an example of what he meant by this, Ben discussed how his attitudes towards other drivers have changed. He used to get very frustrated and angry at people he perceived as being bad drivers. Now he says he doesn't think this is appropriate, and he's working on changing that. He did admit to me that he still talks to other drivers, saying things like, "Did you see that dummy?" But says he hopes he is not motivated by feelings of anger anymore. Rather, he prefers to define these types of observations as casual. One of my participants, Sarah, also shared that she had anger issues before becoming an evangelical Christian. She told me, I didn't realize it myself, but a friend of mine told me that she had never seen anybody so angry as I was. That was one of the first things that seemed to have just dissipated after my conversion. Suddenly, I could let go of things that didn't work. I could let go of people who had hurt me. I could let go of all of that because I had someone who cared and accepted me and had a purpose for me. The someone Sarah is referring to here is Jesus. Upon becoming an evangelical Christian, she says that she found love, purpose, and acceptance, which then could enable her to let go of her anger issues. Both Ben and Sarah are, I believe, narrating ways that their evangelical worldview enabled them to let go of their pre-evangelical conversion experience anger issues. From their perspectives, adopting an evangelical belief system has allowed them to interact in a much healthier way with their social worlds. Participants not only recounted the ways that their evangelical conversion experiences had influenced their personalities and temperaments, several of them also discussed how they adopted new ethical and moral perspectives after converting. I have already mentioned the heavy focus on obeying scriptural dictates in my church, not to mention evangelical circles as a whole. So I find it unsurprising that the participants would embrace biblical moral teachings and endeavor to orient their social lives around them. I believe Elisha, writing in 2011, adds an additional dimension to this when he discusses how the U.S. American evangelicals, in his own research, sought not only to attain these biblical moral standards in their own lives, but also work to inspire these same beliefs in others. In other words, these individuals are aspiring to not only live a biblically ethical life themselves, they also expect those around them who may not share their religious outlook to live a similarly moral life. This meant that, in the case of several of the participants, their newfound evangelical views on morality set them on a collision course with the non-evangelical members of their social groups. Sarah told me that, after becoming an evangelical Christian, some of the things she had seen being done before at work were suddenly not okay anymore. She had a striking example of this, recounting a time shortly after her evangelical conversion when her manager asked her to prepare a falsified letter. And Sarah told her manager that she was uncomfortable doing this, but was told that she could lose her job if she did not obey. Sarah said she went back to her office and prayed, asking the Lord what she was supposed to do in this situation. After praying, Sarah told me, I walked into my manager's office and I told her, okay, this one time, because this transaction is on the line, I will do this. But I can promise you, blood is on your hands, not mine. I am doing this because you ordered it done, so you will be the one that answers for this, not me. As she reflected back on the incident during our interview, she told me, I had to step up and either say, okay, I'm going to do what Jesus expects me to do, or I'm going to give over to the ways of the world. And I couldn't do it. It was very different. Sarah's dramatic narrative shows how drastically her evangelical belief system had altered her views of morality. After their conversation, her manager ultimately rescinded the order and didn't make Sarah prepare the falsified letter. Nonetheless, Sarah's view of right and wrong had been so changed that she was willing to take a stand and risk losing her job because she could not morally do something that, by her own admission, wouldn't have bothered her pre-evangelical self. When considering this narrative in light of Elisha's statement that evangelicals generally expect non-evangelicals to live up to the same biblical standards of morality as themselves, Sarah's disagreement with her manager is almost inevitable because she is holding her manager to the same evangelical moral standards that she herself now lived by. The narrative accounts discussed above represent various, often tangible ways that their evangelical conversion experiences impacted participants' relationships with the non-evangelical inhabitants inhabiting their social world. As can be seen in the lives of these participants, becoming an evangelical Christian affected numerous areas of their lives, including changes in their personalities, temperaments, and ethical belief systems. That profoundly embracing an evangelical belief system should have such a profound impact on participants' social worlds is supported by Carruthers' statement in 1992 that the relationship between participants' inner landscape of thought and the outer landscape of events is inseparable because the metamorphosis of thought entails the metamorphosis of social relations and vice versa. Meaning, the metamorphosis into participants' newly discovered evangelical worldviews inevitably led to a metamorphosis in the way they interacted with and viewed the newly discovered secular world around them. The resultant clashes with this newly discovered secular world depicted within their narratives are the inevitable result of this metamorphosis into their adopted evangelical belief system. As I discovered, their evangelical conversion experiences have had profound impacts upon the lives of congregants at my church. And like the experience I mentioned earlier with the pastor and his wife, all of the participants firmly believed that these oftentimes dramatic conflicts contained within their conversion narratives were a good and much needed part of the rupturing process necessary to align their lives with the evangelical worldview. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicole.
That was fantastic.
Great
I've been,
presentation.
like, writing things down this whole time.
Thank you.
All right, so we're now open for questions. What are everyone's questions?
I have a question. Ted here. Am I on? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Trying to watch this thing. Yeah, really good presentation. And the way you present it, the information is in depth. It's really interesting, and so much credit for that. And I was trying to write notes as fast as I could. You kept going so fast that, or there's so much more information. I was lost sometimes. And I realized that I don't know a lot, and yet that might be like what a lot of, let's say, Americans might be like in this respect. In the former president that we had, and the evangelicals that I think I was reading about who were in support of him, if I've got that correct. First of all, I was kind of struck at least by one experience, and not to make my political side of this too much, but the one time they were in Washington, D.C. in Lafayette Park, and they walked down there with a bunch of folks, and it was kind of evidently a PR op. And Mr. Trump stands in front of the church with a Bible in his hand. And some were making reference to the book that he would never read in front of a building he would never go into. And in the sense of who he was in a personal sense, in a religious sense. And yet it seemed like the evangelicals would support him as an individual, as a president, as that political side of things. And as you were talking about the ethical and moral shifts that the people would have in a conversion, I was just kind of wondering from my perspective, what I think at any rate, how that was happening, how that was possible, not just with him alone, he's just an example, but how evangelicals would find people or organizations or systems like that, politically at least, that in their world, their life thoughts as a group and as individuals, they would accept. Sarah's issue about not writing the letter, that's a good one, and yet would she think that his, in my estimation, pathological lying for certain things is an acceptable process to let this man kind of slide through without calling him on what he's saying at different points in time? How does that evangelical situation work in our political system today, perhaps, is the question.
Yes, that's an excellent question. Thank you so much for it. I think the thing with evangelicals you have to remember is, again, going back to that they orient everything around the Bible and try to take it literally and live their lives according to everything contained within Scripture. So I think, particularly in the case of the former president, the majority of the evangelicals that I know supported him because, yes, they recognized that there were some issues with him, but he stood for some biblical moral principles that they thought were more important than the issue of lying, but then also he was anti-LGBTQ rights. And to them, that was a more important issue and was a bigger thing in the Bible. And so that they were willing to overlook, it's that compartmentalization, that they're willing to compartmentalize. Okay, yeah, there's some issues here, but there's some bigger things that are really important in the Bible. So we're going to support him because of that, if that makes sense.
A question about, and thank you so much, Nicole. I'm so happy that you're here, because to me, this is applied anthropology work, I would say, because of the way that you're going about it, but it's also representing an autoethnographical approach. And I think that's so valuable given this subject matter, given the timeliness of it, and given the misunderstandings that come up and the sort of predominant narratives that are there that need to be offered more nuance. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and I would call you an applied anthropologist, but there you are. I guess the next part is, how is it applied? But one of the things I was curious about is this sort of idea between world and self, and I started to think about semi-permeable membranes, or like there's this meniscus there, right? And so I was interested in the sort of changes in permeability that happen before, during, and after. So if, and before, they're describing that permeability of the world and its effects on the self, and the sort of like the construction and the strengthening of that sphere of the self through the conversion. So then the during being these tribulations and trials of these challenges, and this either or of following Jesus's way or the way of this secular world, is a really interesting sort of like challenge to the self that I think is so tied into that notion of faith, which is also why I appreciate the like bringing in texts like the Bible, like the Gospels. So I was just interested in your thoughts about the sort of permeability of that, and how I really appreciate you talking about with the after, this idea of acceptance of that this is the sort of sad way of this errant person in the world, like in the case of the letter. And that was such a good example, such a strong example. The sort of acceptance, but also not internalization. So like that as a different change of the permeability, that one can see and accept that world, but it doesn't have to actually permeate necessarily in that way. So I was interested in this idea of like where the permeability is. And my other question was about the sort of, well, I just really appreciated the idea of world and self still being inseparable, because that's how you have the meniscus there. That's how you have that sort of like water and air pressure on each other, keeping that self, but that it's necessary for the idea of conversion. So I really appreciated it. I don't know if any of this is helpful or if it's a really question, but this is what it made me think about.
No, that's a really great question, and actually gets to a lot of what I did in my thesis, was understanding, because in the anthropology of Christianity, we talk about rupture all the time. There's the moment of conversion, there's a rupture, but there's also this acknowledgement that that rupture isn't just a one-time occurrence. It's an ongoing, continuing process, because yes, these individuals now inhabit like this evangelical space, if you will, but they can never fully break from it because they live in a world that's not evangelical. And that what my thesis came down to is like they're just constantly coming into conflict with this non-evangelical world, and just their entire lives after becoming an evangelical Christian is made up of these interactions, and they constantly have to like negotiate this relationship because they're in such close proximity, but yet they're so different. And so it's just this continual negotiation. And that's why a lot of the participants that I interviewed for my research, they kept talking again and again about growing in their faith. They were just going to grow deeper and grow closer. And so it was just this idea of just like the longer they're a Christian, the more they can push away that world, but it still kept intruding on them and still having an effect on them. And it's a really interesting relationship. It's kind of, it's stressful in a way almost to live in like that constant negotiation, but they manage it well.
You're making me think of, and this is maybe a strong or maybe a strange comparison, and it, you have to get into different contexts here, but it makes me think about what it's like, just from my perspective, living on a reservation or living like away from a reservation most of my life, and kind of like where I was within that world around me, where it was sort of like there was only the stereotypes, right? And there was only this kind of like sense of opposition and conflict all the time when you are in that world that is set up differently, or even that you perceive as being set up differently. And there being like slightly different contexts there, because you have these sort of racialization and you have colonization, and that's not what's happening here necessarily. But I can see like similar feelings of moving through the world and feeling like you are in a hostile space. And so like I'd be interested in what the strategies are, or even considering strategies as a kind of resilience, like building resilience and building that kind of like, what are the movements of resistance? I mean, I feel a little uncomfortable, like as I'm continuing to make this like comparison a little bit because of those differences in context, but it's interesting to me, that notion of like self and world that I hadn't encountered before in this particular subject matter. So I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I understand your issues with that comparison, but I also think it's a good comparison. And that's not something I had thought of, but the way you were describing, yes, it does make sense of like inhabiting a hostile world. And I think within the evangelical community, one way to negotiate that is that there's just this really heavy focus on surrounding yourself with other evangelicals and like that community, and doing, not just going to church on Sunday morning, but you have Bible studies outside of church. You go to each other's homes, you live nearby each other so your children can play with each other. You send your kids to an evangelical school. So that's the way I think in some ways that they negotiate that relationship.
I appreciate the charity too as an aspect of that. So like how you have your evangelical community, but then you're also proselytizing. So trying to continue moving that world of self outward is really interesting too.
Yes, that's a massive part of the evangelical worldview. Is proselytization. I didn't have time to get into it, but yes, I appreciate you bringing that up because that is really important to them.
I have a quick comment. I thank you for your very timely topic and diving into that, Nicole. Just, I don't know if you've encountered it in depth, but I recommend to anyone who wants to put your presentation into a larger anthropological theory context. There is a fairly recent book within the last year published by prominent Stanford anthropology professor Tanya Luhrmann. And the title of it is When God Talks Back, Understanding the American Evangelical Relationship with God. And it's almost right on point with what you presented with us. And she goes into both diachronic analysis from an anthropological perspective, looks at it across space and time, and really, I think, would put a lot of what you just said into a tremendous perspective for applied anthropologists as well.
I've heard of that book and I've read her work, so thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I recommend it. Anybody who got turned on by your presentation, it sounds like a lot of us were.
Thanks.
I'd like to offer a couple of comments if there's time. Nicole, to me, one of the signs that a presentation or paper is really good is that it makes me think of things I hadn't thought of before. So bingo for yours. One of the things you make me think about is that this radical change of becoming and being an evangelical Christian through conversion, of that radical change is occurring in times of radical change, a great deal of which is toward the secular. And when you talk about the relationship between self and world and it being increasingly hostile, I'm thinking that the recreation of the self through conversion is a kind of removal from that secular world. There's an entrance into a totally different world that is far more significant, important, sacred versus secular. And the hostility, in a way, helps this sounds crazy. The hostility from the secular world helps to support the beliefs and feelings of the person who has had the conversion experience, because they're increasingly opposite. There's the orientation to me, and then there's the orientation to God. And the more I'm surrounded by all these hostile people who are in it for me, the more that confirms the necessity for this creation, well, it is creation, this conversion experience. It helps validate it. It's sort of, oh my God, see, I told you so. And so that the conversion is in part a separation, a withdrawal, a reaffirmation of new boundaries. And I'm just struck by how contextual what you're describing as these 5 or 6 personal narratives, well, one person at a time, as part of a much larger world that is moving more in the direction of secularization. And here the psychodynamic cultural stuff in me comes out, that I'm wondering, are there developmental, psychological, family of origin kinds of things that help propel the person toward almost like a rapture in the world, instead of a rapture out of the world through being dead. It is a kind of a rapture within the world, getting totally separate from this evil, hostile, sacred world. I know probably to evangelical Christians, I'm being terribly defamatory, and I don't mean to be, but it's almost like a rapture within the world, in contrast with having to die physically. You can die in relationship to the world while still be alive and have a new self, the new evangelical self. I don't know whether that's any sense or pure BS, but you really made me think of a lot of things. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those very kind comments, Howard. The things that you're addressing are things that I think are also very fascinating, and I would love to research them myself. I wasn't able to answer those questions with my thesis, but I definitely saw them emerge, and I think they're very relevant to the evangelical experience.
And Nicole, I have a question. When you're doing your research, did you consider things like, Turner's concepts of liminal states, or, Anthony Wallace's concepts of revitalization movements? And like, how did that kind of fit into your, this idea of the rupture? I'm sure other people in the field of Christian anthropology have discussed these kinds of things, but it seemed very much relevant to what you were talking about.
Yes, I did not get into those concepts as much. I was dealing, because within the anthropology of Christianity, they really tend to focus on rupture. And so I was combining that with like concepts of narrative analysis to understand how evangelicals shift in space. But it wasn't like a tangible spatial shift, but there was like an ideological spatial shift. So those are the concepts I dealt with more in my thesis.
Thank you.
I had a question about, I've always found the kind of singular nature of break or, reinvention of self in evangelicalism interesting, even though you talked about how it's kind of an ongoing process as well. But I'm just curious if you've done any kind of, I mean, you talking about that just makes me think of other circumstances where people totally reinvent themselves, and if you've done any kind of comparisons to other religions or other times when, because to me it seems like it's a moment where people can take a look at themselves and say, okay, well, here's all the things I can just let go, and then maybe focus on ethics, morality, and just totally decide I'm a new person today. So I'm just curious if you've done any kind of comparison with other movements and those types of occurrences of reinventing oneself.
Yes, I was able to, in the process of writing the thesis, the conversions to Islam are also a really big field of research, and so I was able to read some very fascinating studies about how a conversion to Islam is not dissimilar to a conversion to Christianity, and how also there's this concept of like pedagogies of conversion where you're like kind of mentored into the faith and taught how to become a Christian, how to become a Muslim. And those are also very similar in Islam and Christianity. And I think it's fascinating. And I'd love to see some more comparative studies done of that.
I had a question associated with the practice of telling your rupture narrative. And this might be outside of the scope of your initial research, but in the telling, have you noticed kind of like an evolution of the telling as like someone becomes more nuanced or practiced in like how to really frame that before and after? Because it kind of makes me think of like in the Amish faith, one of the main places where you can be creatively expressive in a very humble space is through your culinary presentation. So there's a great deal of very modest embellishment in that culinary art. So it made me think of, in that evangelical space, if the art of telling ends up being something that is intentionally crafted and maybe even mentored as part of the process.
Yes, absolutely. I think you're very right with that, because what a lot of the participants told me throughout the process was they called it a testimony. And they're like, I'm so glad you're giving me a chance to tell my testimony because I haven't had an opportunity to share it with other people for a while. And so it was very clear, like this was a story that was crafted to tell how amazing their evangelical conversion experience was, how horrible their life was before, and how radically they've changed after, and what a good thing that is.
I guess a tiny follow-up question. Was there a feeling of letdown if someone was in the space but didn't have a dramatic shift? Like they just grew up in that community and they don't have that journey through the wilderness into the promised land?
So that wasn't something I was able to so much discover in the research, but in my experiences growing up in the evangelical church, I have definitely heard individuals who were born and raised in the church, like express regret that they don't have like this really cool, amazing conversion story like somebody who converted into the church later in life. So that's definitely valid in the church.
I have a short question. The words that some of you are using, I'm not hearing so well, and I'm just double checking. Is the word rapture or rupture?
It's rupture, like a radical break.
R-A or R-U?
R-U.
Okay, thanks. Because I'm hearing that sound a
there,
little bit like
too.
an R-A, and I went rapture, and it's just the way you pronounce it. It's like having an accent or something. So appreciate it. Thank you.
There's something in there though, isn't there? Rapture and rupture.
Well, that's
Something
why it was so
useful to
close.
me.
That's why I was so close. I wasn't sure if we're doing the rupture could be, you know, kind of maybe, what do you call it? Harsh, difficult. Whereas a rapture seems to be a little bit more happy and everybody's, you know, floating to the sky and that sort of thing. So I just wasn't sure whether, you know, just which way I was supposed to think about it. So thank you.
Well, we have time for one more real quick question, and then we have a short break. Would anyone like to ask one final quick question?
Yeah, I've got one real quick.
Go ahead.
I'll try to make it quick. So there's this gentleman named Ched Myers. He's a Christian anarchist, and he spent some time with some Native communities down in South America, and upon having that experience and realizing the differences between himself and the people that came down with him and then the Native communities he was living with, he made this statement, that we in the United States live in an extremely degraded anthropological condition as a result of generations and generations of empire. And so you talked about how, for instance, the lady that didn't want to do the letter, excuse me, so some of these moral changes and transformations coming about. But I wonder, do you hear anybody have these conversion experiences and then wake up to the reality of the role that Christianity has played in perpetuating this oppressive empire that we all live under, or perpetuating the environmental degradation that's been happening for as long as this country has existed? So was there any evidence of anything like that coming out of people's experiences?
That's a really great question. And that's one of my biggest issues with the evangelical community, that they really don't see those sorts of things at all. They are very much, within the evangelical communities I've been in, it's generally white people that are really focused, like all America first, all that sort of stuff. So they're just really not self-aware of any of those issues. I'm sure that those people exist out there, but in the communities I have been within, I have not seen that.
Well, thank you very much. That wasn't a little question, Jesse. That's all right, though. We're headed for break right now. Anyway, we're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we're going to come back at 10:45 with Howard Stein's talk, which is titled Uses of Applied Anthropological Poetry in These Times of Trouble in the U.S. and Worldwide. So we'll come back to in a few minutes. In the meantime, feel free to mingle and chat, and then we will get reorganized at 10:45.